In the early 1800s, European sailors crossing the Pacific often spoke about New Zealand with a mixture of fear and fascination. Stories of heavily tattooed warriors, organized warfare, revenge killings, and even cannibalism spread from ship to ship. But in 1809, one British vessel sailed there anyway, despite this fearsome reputation. Unbeknownst to those on board though, the true danger of the voyage was not what awaited them in New Zealand, but something already unfolding aboard the ship itself. This is that horrifying story, and although the events in this video are fleeting and non-descriptive, they are still highly disturbing, so viewer discretion is strongly advised. Before we get into the video, I want to introduce you to today's sponsor, Obscura VPN. The internet used to work perfectly well without you having to hand over your personal information. Now it seems like every other platform wants your ID, your face, your phone number, or some other sensitive piece of data. And once that information's been collected, there's always the possibility it'll eventually be sold, exposed, or leaked. That's why Obscura takes a different approach to online privacy. Traditional VPN providers can potentially see both your identity and the websites you visit. Obscura is designed so that it physically, or more accurately, cryptographically, cannot connect who you are with your internet activity. Obscura's protocol also blends your traffic in with the rest of the internet. This helps it to actually continue to work in places where more traditional VPN connections might be detected or blocked. And crucially, the service is completely open source. That means security researchers, developers, and privacy nerds can inspect their code and servers themselves, rather than simply trusting the company's claims. It also includes built-in blocking for online ads and trackers, which you can configure depending on how much tracking you're comfortable allowing. And because Obscura is a small, independent company built specifically around privacy, you don't even need to provide an email address when you create an account. So if you're looking for a genuinely privacy-first VPN, go to obscura.com/scary or scan the QR code on screen now to get 25% off your subscription. This brings the price to only $6 a month. Huge thanks again to Obscura for sponsoring this video, and with that said, let's get into today's story. In 1809, a ship known as the Boyd had a bit of an interesting job. Under the command of Captain John Thompson, it was being used as a prisoner transport that took Britain's convicts to Australia. That spring, the Boyd left England with a new load of prisoners bound for New South Wales, which was the British penal colony at the time. After months at sea, it reached Port Jackson, the harbour of Sydney, in August. The ship had carried more than 100 male convicts on this trip, and once the prisoners were delivered, it needed to find a way to make money on the way out of Australia. Obviously, ships didn't sail empty if their owners could help it. Every spare corner of a hold was a chance for profit, so after arriving in Sydney, the Boyd was chartered for another mission. It would sail east to New Zealand, enter Whangaroa Harbour, and take on a cargo of kauri spars, which were timber exports. At the time, these were extremely valuable. Kauri trees could grow tall, straight, and strong, which made them incredibly useful for shipbuilding. So in October, the Boyd left Sydney and headed for Whangaroa. Now, this was a place that European sailors barely knew at the time. Whangaroa sits on the east coast of New Zealand's Northland Peninsula, which is a deep harbour surrounded by steep hills, forests, inlets, and rivers. It was also home to an entire society of people unfamiliar to the British. These were the Maori, and before 1809, contact between them and Europeans had been extremely limited. In fact, it's believed that the Boyd was going to be only the third ship to ever enter Whangaroa Harbour at the time. And so, as you might imagine, every encounter between the Maori and the Europeans was important for stable trade and trust between the two sides. But things to that point hadn't exactly gone smoothly. In 1808, another ship, known as the Commerce, had visited Whangaroa for trade, but this brought new diseases to the Maori with them. After their meeting, illness spread among the local villages and killed a number of Maori. Some of the indigenous people then began to believe that Europeans had placed a curse on them, which did nothing to help trade relations. The Maori began to look at European visitors with a wary eye, which just so happened to be the same way Europeans viewed them. Sailors had heard stories about violence and cannibalism across the Pacific. Some of those stories were exaggerated, but enough of them were based on real events to give European visitors a healthy sense of caution. Both sides, though, did their best to temper their fears and trepidation because establishing trade could be mutually beneficial. Europeans sought premium timber for shipbuilding, while those same ships brought metal tools, weapons, trade goods, and opportunities to Whangaroa, all of which had proven to be useful for the Maori. As the Boyd began its journey to New Zealand from Sydney, it had a young Maori man aboard named Ta'ara. The crew, however, knew him as George, which was common enough on European ships. Sailors often gave indigenous men English names because it was easier for them to remember, or maybe more likely because they had little interest in learning the names those men already had. In this case though, the difference between the two names was extremely significant. To the crew, George was a man aboard a ship who was expected to work. To the Maori, Ta'ara was the son of a chief from Whangaroa. When the Boyd started its voyage towards Ta'ara's home, he had already spent a good amount of time around Europeans. He had been away from home for more than a year to that point, moving between different vessels, including sealing expeditions in the cold islands of the Southern Ocean. As a result, he could speak English well enough to effectively communicate with his fellow crew members, and that likely made him useful aboard a ship like the Boyd. He had boarded the ship because it was an easy and direct way to get back home, and in exchange, he was expected to work his way there, but that may not have been what happened. At some point during the voyage from Sydney, Ta'ara came into conflict with Captain John. Now, exactly what happened is difficult to pin down because accounts from the time vary. In one version of the events, Ta'ara refused to work because he was sick. In another, he refused because he was the son of a chief and did not believe he should be subject to manual labor. Another version suggests he was accused of stealing pewter spoons. And yet another says the ship's cook had accidentally thrown those spoons overboard and blamed Ta'ara to avoid being punished for his mistake. But while the exact trigger for the issue will likely never be known, what is clear is what happened next. John ordered that Ta'ara be punished, and that punishment was brutal. First, Ta'ara was denied food and purposely starved. Then, he was tied to the ship and whipped with a cat-o'-nine-tails, which is a multi-tailed lash used for flogging. For whatever his offense was, Ta'ara received 25 lashes before the final insult came when all of his possessions were taken away from him by the crew. Now, as horrific as this is for us today, for the crewmen aboard the Boyd, this may have seemed like normal discipline. British ships operated under a harsh system, and flogging was a familiar punishment. Sailors could be beaten for disobedience, and convicts could be whipped for any number of reasons. It was a system designed to protect the power of the captain and ensure the subservience of the crew, but importantly, Ta'ara did not abide by this system. In Maori society, status carried enormous weight, and rank was far more than just a source of family pride. It influenced a person's standing in society and established how they were expected to be treated. As the son of a chief, Ta'ara was accustomed to being regarded with reverence and respect, but when he claimed his status as the son of a Maori chief aboard the Boyd, the crew and passengers just ridiculed him. And that was before he was bound and flogged in front of the entire ship. To Ta'ara, this was far more than just a customary maritime form of punishment. It was a complete and total humiliation. It was an insult to his body, his rank among the Maori, his name, and his mana, which is the authority and standing that came with who he was. In Maori terms, something like this demanded utu, which amounted to nothing less than revenge. In December of 1809, the Boyd finally reached Whangaroa, and John's plan from that point was fairly straightforward. The harbor had access to all the kauri trees the captain could want, and if all went well, the Boyd would take on the spars and quickly leave New Zealand behind. As the ship came into the bay, canoes came out to greet it, and among the men who approached the ship was Pepio, Ta'ara's father. He took Ta'ara from the Boyd and brought him back to shore, and once there, the entire situation changed. Ta'ara told Pepio and his people of what had occurred during the voyage and showed them the marks left behind on his back from the flogging. Pepio then became visibly furious and wanted to retaliate against the crew of the Boyd immediately, but Ta'ara managed to calm him down and convinced his father that patience would be a better strategy. At his urging, the Maori waited for 3 days while John and his crew continued arranging for timber. Everything to them still looked like this would be a rather routine trade arrangement, but Ta'ara and the Maori were preparing for retribution the entire time. At the end of those 3 days, Maori guides invited John to go ashore and inspect the surrounding trees. John accepted and soon left with his chief officer and 3 other men, following the guides away from the vessel toward the entrance of a river. The rest of the crew and passengers, meanwhile, remained aboard to prepare for the ship's eventual departure. When the guides had led John and his companions far enough away from the Boyd, a ruthless attack began. The 5 Europeans were overwhelmed by the Maori and killed with clubs and axes. Before he was overcome, though, John managed to fire 1 shot from his shotgun, and this tragically struck and killed a Maori child, adding another death to a situation that had already spun far out of control. After John and the others were gone, the Maori then stripped them of their clothing. These items would serve as suitable disguises for what was to come. Some of the attackers then put on the clothes as they waited for night to fall, and when it did, they loaded up in the Boyd's longboat that had carried John and the others to the river. In the dark, the disguises gave the Maori the cover they needed. From the deck, the boat looked like the captain's party coming back from the Timber Errant, And if anyone had any doubts, Ta'ara helped ease them by calling out to the ship. The familiar voice was all it took to receive a welcome aboard. Once the disguised attackers were on deck though, they wasted very little time in dispatching the first person they encountered, which was the officer on watch. This opened up the ship to the rest of the attack. Other Maori canoes were waiting nearby, and once the signal came, more warriors stormed the void. From that moment, the ship's passengers and crew were trapped. The Maori focused on the crew first, and some were killed quietly before they could alert the others. Once the crew was completely gone, the attackers began calling passengers up from below one by one. Many of them would have come up without understanding the danger, but either way, they were swiftly taken care of. Among the growing number of dead were men, women, and those who were even younger. In the chaos, a few people would manage to scramble up the ship's rigging to avoid being killed, but from there they could only cling to the mast and watch the horrific attack unfold beneath them. This would continue throughout the night, and when it was complete, the destruction was beyond anything that anyone could have imagined. The exact number of dead varies slightly by account, but most place it somewhere between 66 and 70 people. When the Maori were finished decimating most of those aboard the void, they brought all the bodies ashore. From there, they proceeded to have a feast that lasted for days as they prepared, cooked, and ate down to the bone. Throughout all of this, the handful of those who climbed up the ship's rigging were left there until morning, while a few select others were spared by the Maori outright. One of the latter group was Anne Morley, who survived with her baby. Another was a young apprentice aboard the ship named Thomas Davis. Also kept alive were the void's second mate, who was not named in the sources, and a 2-year-old little girl named Elizabeth Broughton, who was better known as Betsy. Thomas may have been allowed to live because of how he treated Ta'ara after the flogging. According to later accounts, Thomas had shown Ta'ara kindness and may have smuggled food for him after John deprived him of it. Anne and her baby may have been saved for a similar reason, as she helped take care of Ta'ara following his 25 lashes. Those still grabbing onto the ship's mast survived by sheer luck, at least for a little while. As morning broke over the void's blood-soaked deck, another canoe suddenly entered the harbor. Aboard it was a man named Tapahi, a chief from the Bay of Islands. Tapahi was not one of the Whangaroan men who planned the attack on the void. In fact, he was known as a powerful indigenous figure who supported trade with the Europeans, and he had even visited Sydney several years earlier. He had also come to the area to trade with the Whangaroan men, and when his canoe came within sight of the void, Tapahi heard the survivors calling out for help. Immediately, he was shocked by what he saw, and he quickly moved to rescue them. He gathered the frightened Europeans from the ship and attempted to get them away, and for a moment, it seemed like help had arrived at the best possible time. But as Tapahi's canoe moved through the harbor, the Whangaroa Maori suddenly appeared and pursued it in their own canoes. When Tapahi's boat reached the shore, the void survivors tried fleeing along the beach, but their pursuers soon caught them. As Tapahi was held back, the others attacked those who ran. After it was finished, Tapahi was then allowed to go free. After everything was done and revenge had been enacted, the void was towed closer to their village until it was grounded on mudflats near Red Island. For several days, it was then ransacked. They searched the ship's stores and cargo, taking what they wanted and throwing other goods overboard. Flour, salt, pork, bottled wine, and other supplies were either scattered along the shore to be taken to their village or discarded in the bay. In one of the void's holds, the Maori also located the ship's weapon stores. The vessel carried muskets and gunpowder, but handling those items was dangerous for people unfamiliar with powder stores. A group of Maori tried to make the muskets usable, and barrels of gunpowder were opened and spilled all over the deck. At some point, one of the Maori then sparked a flint on one of the guns, and the spark ignited the gunpowder. An explosion then tore through the ship and killed several instantly, with the exact number varying by account. Some say 4 or 5 died, while others put the number closer to 15. But in any case, Ta'ara's father Pepio was among those who perished in the explosion. Fire then tore through the void, and once the flames took hold, the ship could not be saved. Its cargo also included a considerable supply of whale oil, which only helped feed the blaze. The fire swept through what remained of the vessel into the void, burned down to the waterline. By the time the fire burned itself out, the ship that had sailed into Whangaroa looking for timber was little more than a blackened, sunken hull. In the aftermath of all of this, news of the events didn't stay confined to Whangaroa for long. About 30 miles away, near the Bay of Islands, word reached a man named Alexander Berry, who was the supercargo of a ship called the City of Edinburgh. Alexander was not the captain of the ship, but as supercargo, he was responsible for its commercial business. Under normal circumstances, his concerns would have been cargo, trade, and especially profit, but the news coming out of Whangaroa changed that. The void had been destroyed, most of the people aboard had been killed, and there were rumors that a few passengers might still be alive, so Alexander decided to go after them. During his first attempt, he set out in longboats trying to reach Whangaroa, but weather and unreliable support made the effort nearly fall apart. Some of the boats turned back or deserted him. Alexander kept trying, but he eventually had to give up and return to his ship around midnight. The next morning, the weather improved and Alexander decided to try again. This time, he chose his men more carefully and rejected the ones who abandoned him the day before. He was also accompanied by a Maori chief named Metanonglia. Alexander needed someone who could help make contact with the people at Whangaroa without immediately turning the rescue into another bloodbath. This second attempt worked, and Alexander reached Whangaroa, where he found the wreck of the Boyd near the upper part of the harbor. What he saw was the physical aftermath of the events and the explosion. The deck had all collapsed, and the ship's guns, ironwork, standards, and other heavy fittings had fallen in. And in what must have been a grisly sight, there were also remains lying all along the shore. Once he had surveyed the damage to both the ship and human life, Alexander dropped Metanonglia off to arrange a meeting with the local chiefs. After some tense negotiation, it was agreed that the surviving prisoners from the Boyd would be brought to an island near the wreck the next morning. When the chiefs arrived, they handed over 3 people, Anne, her infant child, and Thomas. As had been established during negotiations, Alexander paid the chiefs for them, but he was not yet satisfied. Alexander then asked Anne whether they were the only survivors, and she told him they were not. According to her, the Boyd's second mate and Betsy were still missing. When he asked about them, Alexander received grim news about the second mate. Apparently, another chief had kept him alive for a time and forced him to make fishhooks from iron hoops. When the second mate proved unable to do the work well enough, though, he was finished the same way as all the others. Betsy, however, was still alive, and she was being held by a chief on an island outside the harbor. Alexander then demanded that she be brought to him, and the Whangaroa chief said he would send a servant to order her release, but Alexander did not accept that. He believed a servant might be ignored, especially by a chief on another island, so he insisted that the Whangaroa chief go himself. Citing rough weather as the reason, however, the Whangaroa chief refused. Alexander didn't argue though. He then grabbed the chief by the collar, pointed a pistol at him, and forced him into the boat. He then did the exact same thing with another chief and ordered their attendants to follow. The boat left quickly and headed for the islands where Betsy was being held. Once there, Alexander sent one of the attendants to get the chief, who was holding the little girl, but time passed with no word back. Alexander then began to suspect that the child had already been killed, so he turned to the Whangaroan chief and made a forceful threat. If Betsy was not brought out by the time the sun reached a certain point, Alexander would kill the chief first, then land and kill every man on the island. The chief's face then changed and his eyes became bloodshot. He looked as if he might lunge at him, but Alexander drew a sword and held it at the ready. The 2 men stared at each other, neither willing to make the first move, but then the chief's anger broke and he lowered his head as he started to sob. Soon after this altercation, young Betsy was brought to the boat, and with that, Alexander had recovered the 4 survivors who could still be saved. That was not the end, though. Alexander's men asked for permission to land and kill the people on the island for the sake of revenge, but Alexander refused. He told them it would be useless cruelty and cowardice to do that, so the issue was dropped. Alexander still didn't release the chiefs aboard his boat, though. Instead, he decided to use them to recover the Boyd's papers and logbook. Those papers could help the ship's owner provide proof of what happened, so he took the chiefs back to the city of Edinburgh, put them in irons, and ordered that the Boyd's documents be delivered within 3 days. Within that time span, a young Maori messenger went back overland to Whangaroa and returned with a box of letters, the Boyd's logbook, and loose papers from the ship. Only after the papers were secured did Alexander finally release the chiefs, but before that, he decided to stage a scene. He told the chiefs that in England, men who committed murder were hanged, but because they were chiefs, he would not string them up. He would shoot them instead. Alexander had muskets brought out and personally loaded them, but only with powder and not bullets. The chiefs believed they were about to die as Alexander ordered his men to shoot. The guns then went off without projectiles, and the chiefs remained motionless in fear. As the gun smoke cleared, Alexander then told them they had been spared. He declared they would be degraded from chiefs to servants, and then he handed them over to another chief under that condition, before leaving Whangaroa with the Boyd's few remaining survivors. By the time Alexander was on his way back to the Bay of Islands, the story of the Boyd was spreading rapidly. News moved from ship to ship and settlement to settlement, and with every retelling, the details became more salacious. What had happened aboard the Boyd was horrifying enough on its own, but the aftermath became even worse because the next round of violence was driven by rumor and mistaken blame. Tragically, the man who suffered the most from the confusion was Tapahi. Again, he wasn't involved in the planning or execution of the events and had only arrived afterward. That's not the story that was going around though, and part of the confusion likely came from his name itself. Te Pahi was apparently mixed up with a Maori man of a similar name, who is said to have been one of the men involved in the planning. This was only made worse by the fact that Te Pahi had accepted one of the Boyd's small boats and some goods that were taken from the wreck. To the Europeans who found these items in his possession, this amounted to evidence of his involvement. As a result, in March of 1810, sailors from several whaling ships gathered and launched a retaliatory attack, and their target was Te Pahi's village. The violence was again brutal, and once again, accounts disagree on the number of dead. Somewhere between 16 and 60 Maori were finished in Te Pahi's village, and Te Pahi himself was badly wounded in the neck and chest during the attack. Once he understood why he had been attacked though, Te Pahi somewhat admirably turned his anger toward Whangaroa. He then gathered his remaining warriors and went after the people who had actually been involved in the Boyd attack. Sometime before April 28, 1810, Te Pahi led an attack on Whangaroa, and during the fighting he was struck by a spear and subsequently died from his wounds. With his death though, the violence committed during and as a direct result of the Boyd finally came to an end. Alexander then took the Boyd passengers and crew aboard the City of Edinburgh, which was bound for the Cape of Good Hope in South Africa, or at least that was the plan. After leaving New Zealand, the City of Edinburgh ran into horrible weather conditions and was damaged badly enough that the voyage had to be redirected. Instead of reaching the Cape of Good Hope, the ship eventually made its way to Lima, Peru, where Alexander tried to figure out what to do with the Boyd survivors. Their lives would end up splitting off in different directions from there. Thomas left Lima aboard a different ship and made his way back to England. Years later, he crossed paths with Alexander again and returned to New South Wales with him. Betsy, meanwhile, was taken onward from Lima, and she and Anne's child eventually traveled through Rio de Janeiro before returning to Sydney in 1812. Betsy grew up and got married and became the mother of a large family. Anne's fate, however, is less clear. Some accounts say she died in Lima, but Alexander's own writings suggest that this report was wrong and that Anne survived, lived in Sydney, and ran a school with her sister. But while the fate of the survivors is slightly unclear, the larger impact of the events on the Boyd was not nearly as uncertain. News of what happened spread through Australia and Europe, badly damaging European willingness to visit New Zealand. For years, sailors had already circulated rumors about danger and cannibalism in the Pacific, and the Boyd seemed to confirm many of those fears. New Zealand's reputation among Europeans deteriorated rapidly, and ships were warned against stopping there. Trade dropped sharply, and for several years, European shipping to New Zealand slowed dramatically. With all of that said though, if there is any silver lining to the ordeal, it's that tensions de-escalated relatively quickly in the decade that followed. In a somewhat uncharacteristic pattern for frontier conflicts of the era, some Europeans came to recognize the role of utu, or revenge, as justice in the events surrounding the Boyd. So rather than spiraling into a lasting cycle of escalation, trade and relations gradually resumed. And by the late 1810s, contact between the Maori and Europeans had largely normalized once again. If you made it this far, thanks so much for watching, and a special thanks to everyone who supports the channel on Patreon or as a channel member. If you're interested, we offer early access videos that are released roughly a week before the regular YouTube uploads. Also, if you have a story suggestion, feel free to submit it using the form found in the description. Anyways, thanks again, and hopefully I will see you in the next one.